This video is pretty cool, but if you're not already familiar with Georgian, I would really recommend that you watch my previous video on the Georgian case marking system. This isn't a direct sequel or anything like that, so if you don't get confused, you're golden, but I brush over a lot of Georgian grammar stuff that is explained much more thoroughly in that video, so if I'm going too fast, you might consider giving that a watch. Now, on to the part that I recorded last week. While reading Alice Harris's Diachronic Syntax analysis of the Kartvelian languages lately, I came across a lovely example that really encapsulates the beauty of historical linguistics that I thought would be good to talk about. It's related to the formation of the Kartvelian first series of conjugations from the second, but it involves a bit more than just verbs, so if you'll humor me for a moment, I think this video should have a satisfying conclusion. So if any of y'all have ever studied Georgian, you might have thought that there is a lot of morpheme reuse going on. This "u" prefix could mark a third-person indirect object, or mark negation in any number of derivations like a negative participle. This ending "a" could be any number of verb conjugations, or the copula "aorist" attached in short form to a noun, or an extended case marker, or a conjugation ending. This "m" before a consonant or verb root could mark a first-person direct or indirect object, or an inverted subject, or mark a few kinds of participles. But one of the most prevalent is that the morpheme "eb" could serve as an agglutinative plural marker, or as a series marker in the first series of screeves, or as a part of a non-finite verb form like a participle or a verbal noun. As I said, there's a lot of this kind of thing in Georgian where one morpheme can appear in hella places, and in the case of "eb", there's a pretty satisfying reason why. So let's take a look at how this happened. I said it served as an agglutinative plural marker in the modern language, so a good first step might be to look at the noun declension in Old Georgian. According to most analyses, there are 8 cases that decline like this. Note that in the plural form there is one declension for the nominative, and the rest of the plural cases look the same. But wait, interestingly enough, the modern Georgian plural marker "eb" does not appear here. Well, it turns out, Old Georgian also had a collective marker "eb", present from Proto-Kartvelian, which is similar but still distinct from the plural. The collective marker was agglutinative in that it could combine with the case marker following it. You can see on the chart that the case declension for the collective marker is just the marker "eb" followed by the normal singular declension endings. A noun marked as collective is a group, but it is regarded as an undifferentiated whole rather than as composed of separate individuals. A good example of collective nouns in English is our terminology for groups of animals. The difference between the plural and the collective is sort of the difference between lions and a pride, or geese and a flock. Now, if this sounds a lot like the plural to you, well, apparently it did to some Georgians between now and the year 500, because this collective marker has been reanalyzed as the standard way to indicate plain old plurals. So in the modern language, this "eb" can be used in conjunction with case morphology to indicate the plural number. But of course, that isn't all that happened with this marker, so let's talk about verbs for a bit. I've said before that modern Georgian has 10 conjugations divided into 3 series that conjugate differently and require different case marking and all that. In fact, all known Kartvelian languages have such a system, though some have a 4th series as well. This is because Proto-Kartvelian, the latest language from which all modern Kartvelian languages descended, also had this 3-series system. But of course, we can still go back further to some early common Kartvelian, where the verb forms just have 3 oppositions instead of the many series of the modern language: a durative, a punctual, and a subjunctive. These were the forms that would eventually evolve into the Series 2 forms. This is the reason you might hear that the Kartvelian Series 2 is older than Series 1 and 3. Now, Series 1 was the next to develop. The way this happened was, the old collective marker was actually added as a suffix along with some conjugation soup after the root verb in the old Series 2 conjugations to get a Series 1 conjugation. This suffix actually changed the verbal aspect. Series 1 ended up being a mirror of Series 2, but the Series 1 verbs were generally the durative version of the Series 2 punctual verbs, and we also see the verbs starting to differ in the category of tense as well. Durative and punctual are both verbal aspects. A punctual action is seen as instantaneous and is not characterized as having lasted any amount of time, whereas a durative action is characterized as spanning some amount of time, however short. If you think about it, this verb suffix meaning should make sense. The collective marker attached to a noun denotes a group of that noun analyzed as one complete unit, so attaching it to a verb root should analyze it as a group of that action analyzed as one unit or one overarching action. Sounds like durative to me. So through this suffixation, this durative punctual subjunctive single series system evolved into what we see here. The terminology used is a bit modern-centric. The aorist and imperfect tenses are just a punctual and durative past tense respectively. Same with the subjunctives, which were used to talk about the future, among other things. The series 1 present evolved from the old durative to become the normal present tense. However, the habitual, since it was already of a durative aspect before this change, stayed durative, and it just represented a tenseless durative or a habitual in opposition to the specifically present tense series 1 form. As a side note for the linguists among you, I'll say that a lot of scholars think this was actually accompanied by object demotion, such that the direct objects in second series verbs were marked as indirect objects in the new first series forms, and the first series verbs were surface intransitives. Combined with the depiction of Proto-Kartvelian as an ergative language, note I said ergative, not active, with intransitive subjects marked in the nominative, this idea explains why the first series is of nominative-accusative alignment, because initially all series 1 verbs were intransitive, and thus subjects were marked in the nominative and indirect objects in the dative. Then later these phrases were reanalyzed as transitive, but the cases stayed the same, so that we have that series 1 is nominative-accusative while series 2 is ergative or active. Now, back to verbs. If we skip forward quite a bit into early Old Georgian, we have that the series 1 and 2 forms evolved into the forms listed in this conjugation table of an Old Georgian verb. The meanings aren't super important here, so I won't elaborate too much, but we see that there is also a series 3, which has an evidential meaning. I'll probably talk about this in another video, but for now I'll mostly ignore it. Now you might have noticed that there is actually no eb suffix here, and the Georgian speakers among you might have had that thought a lot sooner, but there are actually many different thematic suffixes or series markers that appear as series 1 suffixes in the modern languages, not just eb. When I say series marker, I mean a suffix that appears after verbs in series 1 that marks the first series. As I said, the collective marker was initially added as this suffix, so the modern series markers generally descended from that suffix. I'm not going too deep into phonetics here, but this chart shows the Georgian series markers that evolved from eb. Eb is still perhaps the most common of the series markers, and the other common modern series markers consist of a vowel followed by a labial consonant, which of course is very close to eb. So in Old Proto-Kartvelian, the collective eb was added as a series marker to mark a durative, and through time and phonological changes, it evolved into this set of clearly similar suffixes. The exception, of course, is the series marker e, which is the subject of a lot of debate as to how it came about and whether it should even be considered a series marker. So back to the Old Georgian verb. Note that the first series scribes all feature the series marker ob from that last chart. This is, again, just a vowel quality difference from the collective eb. And I've seen it proposed that the ob series marker resulted from the eb marker preceded by a labial approximant wa or a labial fricative va. Also note that the series 3 perfect conjugation has this marker as well. This conjugation, unlike the other perfect conjugations, is actually based on a series 1 form rather than a series 2 form, so this can have a series marker in Old Georgian as well as in the modern day. So you can actually see that there are quite a few of these conjugations. I won't go very far into what components they have, but it is important to note that all of the conjugations have a preverb, in this case, gone, that goes before the verb. There are a few different preverbs, including null, that all Kartvelian verbs can take that often help to indicate direction or aspect of the verb, especially with motion verbs as you see in this chart, or just generally distinguish verbs from one another. The first and second series still carry an aspectual distinction from Proto-Kartvelian, only now instead of series 1 durative opposing series 2 punctual, we have series 1 imperfective opposing series 2 perfective. Of course, we all know from good old Indo-European that perfective is a verbal aspect pertaining to completed actions, and imperfective is one pertaining to incomplete actions. It should be pretty easy to see why this could happen, as perfective and punctual both start with a P. It's quite nice that Georgian has such a rich literary history, as we actually have a recorded timeline of how it progressed from this point. Throughout the Old Georgian period, people started leaving out these preverbs sometimes in series 1, and this lack of a preverb started being associated with an imperfective aspect, and the presence of a preverb was associated with a perfective aspect. This is how the distinction works in modern Georgian language shown now. In fact, this is how all of the modern Kartvelian languages do things. Often change will start with Georgian, the important literary language, and then trickle down to the other non-literary Kartvelian languages because of Georgian's relative notoriety. So anyways, now you can see that unlike in Old Georgian, the first series is kind of subdivided, where these three scribes on the left are without a preverb and of imperfective aspect, and these three scribes on the right carry a preverb and are perfective and sort of future versions of the left-hand side present past tenses. so sometimes you'll hear talk of a present and future subseries. And this distinction extends to the rest of the series as well. The second and third series screeves all come with a preverb and they are all perfective. So in light of this, the aspectual distinction between the first and second series is actually gone. So what we are left with is the fact that this eb morpheme no longer marks an imperfective or durative aspect, but it's just a marker for certain conjugations that may or may not be perfective and may or may not be in the first series. And it's not just limited to active verb forms. Passive verbs also have this suffix in all of these places and can even have them in more of the perfect series conjugations because these passive perfect conjugations are often based on masdars and participles, which we'll get to later. I'll also say that passive verbs generally carry the series marker eb, even if their active counterpart carries one of the other series markers. So this collective guy proper is much more common in passive verbs than even active verbs. With the medioactive verbs, or class 3 verbs, it's actually a more interesting story. These guys did not have preverbs in Old Georgian, and they also didn't have these series markers, as you see in this conjugation chart. But when the set of screeves changed from Old Georgian to Georgian, and preverbs started to carry aspectual meaning, these guys needed a way to mark that future subseries, and started using a circumfix with pre-root version vowel e and series marker eb to mark the future subseries of the present series, which as we just saw was marked with preverbs for plain active or passive verbs. Why exactly this is, I can't really say, but it's probably due to this eb's association with the present series, and certainly isn't to do with its previous durative meaning. It's certainly something that is interesting to think about because this suffix is being applied so late after it lost its original meaning. It's not applied as a durative marker, it's applied as an aspect-neutral series 1 marker. So with medioactive verbs, this eb doesn't mark a screeve as part of the first series, but rather the future subseries of the first series. Cool beans. Now, this suffix's appearance is not limited to the finite verb forms. The non-finite verb forms also heavily feature this lad. In Common Kartvelian, the masdar, or verbal noun of any given verb, meaning something like to do X or doing X, was actually formed from the series 1 transitive stem of that verb and is the standard verbal noun in use today. Of course, the series 1 transitive stem is formed with the addition of this collective eb, so we have that the verbal noun doing or to do is gaketeba, as just one example. Now there are some other non-finite verb forms that we'll also see with this suffix, like the present active participles. For the verb to do, it is ketebeli, which acts as a noun or adjective meaning one who does. We also have a past participle, a future active participle, and negative participle. These were formed from the masdar, so they also have this stem when appropriate. If the verb carries a different series marker, then the verbal noun will be formed using that marker, perhaps conditioned by ablaut or something. So the general picture that emerges is that at some point we have early Common Kartvelian with only one series and a collective marker separate from the plural. First we see the emergence of a series 1 opposed with this inherited series 2 through the addition of this collective marker to the verb form in order to change the verbal aspect. The original collective kept its forms in some verbs and gave rise to a group of similar forms in others. Then we see the disappearance of these series-based aspectual distinctions in favor of preverb-based aspect distinctions, thus separating the collective-born series marker from the aspect that it used to convey. Similarly, on the noun side of things, we see the reanalysis of the collective noun suffix as a plural. In addition to all this, we also have masdars and participles of verbs formed from the newly standardized Series 1 stems also carrying the suffix without any durative or imperfective meaning. I think what makes this so impressive to me is just how common this morpheme is in all of its roles. This guy is the most common series marker that can appear in 8 of the 10 active verb conjugations and just about always does for passive verbs, which are obviously super common. And this guy appears in non-finite verb forms as well, and even in something as basic as plurals, so you can imagine how common it is to see this in any sample of the language. So to recap, the original collective marker applied itself in a few different places in the Kartvelian system, and through time in those places lost its original meaning, so we have this morpheme and relative morphemes occurring in a bunch of different words with a bunch of very varied functions because of how the language has changed over time. That's pretty awesome if you ask me.